Awesome to see some first-time filers here, as well as folks with a lot of experience. Tried to gear this presentation to be useful for both ends of the spectrum. So whether you've never filed a request or you've been filing for years and you're just looking to dig into COVID-19 and coronavirus-related records, we'll look to help. I'd also love to share tips and tricks that other folks have found. So if you've got something you want to share with the group, or a clever public records request, or a records request based story that you want to share, feel free to drop that into the Q&A or the chat, and we'll highlight it later. Okay, since it's a Friday afternoon, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to be here. I'm Michael Morrissey. I'm the co-founder of MuckRock. We've been around for about a decade, and we're a nonprofit that helps people file, track, and share public records requests. We've helped file over 80,000 public records requests, and we've been very busy the past few months helping newsrooms, researchers, and the general public dig into sort of what's going on with their government, and how the government agencies are responding to coronavirus, both in direct ways when it comes to public health, but also indirect ways in all the different um, formats that the virus has reshaped sort of public life. This is the first of an ongoing training series. We're doing a project called COVID Public Info in partnership with Outlier Media, Garance Burke, and Matt Kiefer. We're really excited to kind of come together and talk through how to use public records and transparency to kind of better inform folks about what's going on in the world. If you want to sign up for future trainings and more information, there's that link up there. bit.ly/COVID Public Info is the name of the project. We're working on setting up a standalone website for the project, but for now, there is an occasional newsletter where we'll announce these trainings, as well as data, public records tips, and example stories that you can kind of build upon. This project is funded by the John S. Knight Journalism Fellowship at Stanford University, and so we're very grateful for their support in making this happen. So first, I kind of wanted to give a little background for those folks who are new to public records, or maybe want a little bit of a refresher, just Public Records 101. So starting with sort of what makes a good request. So one of the things that we talk with a lot of FOIA offices and a lot of government officials, and one of the things that's really challenging for them to deal with, is when somebody asks for, I want documents, any and all documents about X. I think a lot of times people sort of, when they're first coming to public records, treat it kind of like Google, where if you type in something that's vaguely spelled right, Google usually comes back with pretty good results. Public records, you really want to be more targeted whenever possible. A good request is one where the agency is able to figure out what you're talking about and go after it, know specifically where to look. It also makes it harder for agencies to kind of wiggle out of requests. A lot of times we'll see agencies come back and say, oh, we couldn't find responsive documents, or we're not sure what you're looking for, or these documents don't exist. When you go to an agency and you can say, this is exactly the form I want, or this is the material that I'm interested in, and you give them a very sort of mechanical search, it makes it a lot harder for them to say, oh, that doesn't exist, because they kind of sense that you have an idea of what you're talking about, and they're going to dig in a little bit harder. Setting date parameters. One thing is that these agencies have been around for a long time. They don't really have the best record keeping practices in a lot of cases. And so if you can limit your request to just the period that you're interested in, you're going to be able to file more specific, concrete requests that are, the agency is going to be less likely to come back to you with high fee estimates. A lot of times we've seen agencies, you'll submit, hey, I want a copy of emails that mention these keyword terms, and then they'll come back and say, oh, what are the dates of those keywords? So what you want to do is include date parameters up front. And if you don't want to miss things on the back end of that request, you can sort of say, I want requests generated between January 1st, 2020 and the date this request is processed. Or use something where it's kind of relative language. so that the agency doesn't try to say, oh, technically speaking, your request asked for March 1st. We didn't process this request till March 30th. So you can use creativity, but trying to create parameters around your request is going to make it less likely that the agency is going to push back. Explain your status. Most of the folks on this call are probably reporters, and so I think letting the folks know that this is part of your reporting journalistic process goes a long way towards getting that agency to treat your request seriously. If you're filing this request as part of a nonprofit work or public research work, letting people know that makes them more flexible when it comes to fees. One of the things we've seen is that most requests that an agency gets are from commercial requesters. And so letting them know that this is for a public purpose, that you're asking these questions not for your profit, but for informing the public, make sure that they don't assess improper fees on you. Citing how you know a document exists, right? So not all the time. Sometimes you're going to ask for something and that agency, you don't know what that form is. You're not even sure if that agency has it. Maybe you're asking for a disaster preparedness plan from a bunch of different agencies and you don't know if they've even prepared for a disaster. But sometimes you're going to go to an agency and hey, they're going to have a copy of this file or something else. When you can tell an agency, oh, the mayor referenced this document, or the chief of police said that 30 days after this announcement, they would have a plan in place. I want a copy of that plan. Anytime you can include a citation like that, that lets the agency know that this document definitely exists, not only makes it harder for them to say, oh, we have no idea what you're talking about, but it is generally useful information, right? So maybe you word something a specific way that makes logical sense, but the agency internally, they're used to calling it some other technical term that you're not even aware of. By giving them sort of clues like that, you're making it a lot easier for them to kind of quickly locate and respond with those documents. And then being creative, right? I think a lot of times we think of public records as PDFs and documents, but as more and more government goes digital, as we have video like this, like internal trainings at government agencies are increasingly video as well, be thinking broadly about what is a document, what is a record. It doesn't have to be a piece of paper, it doesn't even have to be an Excel spreadsheet, right? You can ask for copies of social media monitoring reports. You can ask for copies of videos that an agency keeps. Sometimes people have successfully requested browser history from government officials and that sort of thing. So a request can be very broad and sort of think about data that is generated. Now, it does have to be for an existing document or data. Agencies love pushing back and say, we're not going to create a new document to answer your question, but thinking through what are the documents that are going to answer the questions you have. And there's a whole wide world of stuff that can be really helpful in kind of digging into the questions you have. And then finally, keeping it to one page whenever possible, right? I think a lot of times we see sort of, particularly nonprofits and when law firms file requests, or you've got national nonprofits where they have a lot of lawyers help write a request, you can definitely tell. They'll have like a 7-page, 8-page request that has all these citations to sort of prior cases and that sort of thing. What we generally recommend is keeping it short. I think one of the things that public records officials have a really hard time doing is sort of sometimes figuring out what people are even asking for. Now, sometimes it makes sense to keep in mind that, hey, this agency has previously rejected something, or there was a recent court ruling or other decision that kind of said this document needs to be released now. So for example, we're doing a campaign asking for policing records in New York State. They recently changed the law 50A. They repealed parts of it that let disciplinary records be secret. So we included a citation letting folks know, hey, the law has changed. Here's the updated guidance in that specific case. But generally speaking, you want to keep requests simple, readable, and understand that they're going to get passed around. Requests should not include cite every possible law, right? One time somebody shared over a template they were really proud of, and in that template there was citations of federal law, state law, I think some general human rights language. What you want to do is kind of cite that specific state's law or the federal law, but don't include too much information. I think a lot of times that ends up hurting your request more than it does to help it. including extraneous arguments or background on that request, right? I think a little bit of background, particularly if you're doing a larger project, can be really helpful. Maybe a sentence or two kind of explaining, hi, we're doing an audit of every school district in the state, or we think that this document is likely to exist because the mayor said that they were going to start tracking violations of the liquor law or whatever else there is out there. Include a little bit of that just to help them find that request. Imagine that if you were kind of coaching them where to look or coaching them on context, one or two sentences is really good, but you don't need to kind of outline your full investigation for them right within that request. You don't need to say, oh, I think the mayor is corrupt and this is going to show it by, whatever else. So just try to keep that fairly straightforward and limited, and just try to think what is actually going to be useful for them when they're looking for these records. Don't bury your request in legalese. I think a legal citation to the law is very helpful, and there's been studies that have found that if you cite the specific records law that you're requesting under, that actually improves the responsiveness of the agency. But including a lot of legalese, threatening a lawsuit, sort of starts things on an antagonistic foot, and also just makes it harder for them to parse what you're actually asking for. And finally, don't forget that there's a human on the other side of the process, right? I think particularly right now, during COVID-19, agencies are being asked to do a lot with very limited resources and under sometimes constraints. Maybe they can't actually go into the office and look through the filing cabinets like they're used to. So making sure that you take that into consideration and go in and sorry about that. Make sure you remember that there's a human on the other side of the process, and work with them rather than fighting. Finally, assume your request will get passed around. Most agencies have lots and lots of employees. If you're requesting somebody's emails, there's a very, very good chance that the person whose emails you're requesting is going to see that request. But also assume that some people are this email is just gonna pop up their inbox. They might not have a whole lot of experience with public records. And so keeping things clear and to the point is gonna be really helpful. Agencies usually like talking on the phone. That's going to vary wildly from agency to agency, and some agencies don't want to talk on the phone. But sometimes they'll be able to tell you things over the phone, or they'll be able to help you better tailor your request in a way that they might not want to put in writing because they don't want to annoy their colleagues. And finally, try to think like a FOIA officer. And I use FOIA very broadly. I mean, both the federal law as well as state and local law, but try to think through if you were the person who was handling these records requests, how would you approach this situation? What are the kinds of information you would need to kind of get things moving? Because a lot of times it's the records officer who's having to fight internally. They're usually not the holdup. It's usually they're going to their colleagues and saying, hey, I asked for this a couple of weeks ago. Can you get it back to me? And figuring out how do you work with them to get them leverage so that they can go out and pursue your request. And I've actually had FOIA officers who said, you should go ahead and file an appeal because then I can escalate that a little bit more than I could than if you're just waiting for those documents. I want to talk a little bit about what's changed in requesting during COVID, because things are different. Government operations are working differently, but for the most part, still working. We have seen some agencies say that we're going to try and put public records requests on a complete standstill. But mostly agencies are just asking for a little more time and a little more flexibility. Earlier in the pandemic, early in March or mid-March, shortly after things started getting really bad, Chicago simply said, we don't see public records requests as an essential service. They reversed course later that day, which is really good to see. So keep in mind that sort of public awareness and public pushback on these things really does make a difference. We're also seeing agencies sort of change how they accept requests. So for some reason, the FBI said they were going to stop accepting electronic requests and only accept mailed requests. They later reversed that practice as well. A lot of agencies, however, have done the opposite and say, we're not going to take physical requests during the pandemic, but we will take electronic requests. So things are at reduced capacity. A lot of times, particularly archival documents are less available than they used to be. But I have also heard anecdotally from some agency personnel that certain types of requests are getting processed a lot faster because they're not dealing with sort of records requests that require going into the archives. So instead, they're able to spend more time working on quicker, simpler requests. Some tips when dealing with agencies during the pandemic is reaching out and being empathetic. I think a lot of agencies, again, they're operating under reduced resources. So saying, hey, I understand these are challenging. Let me know if there's a way I can modify my request to get a more quick result. And also trying to understand what those constraints they're working under. Agencies have not done a great job of digitizing their records over the past few decades. And so now they're trying to kind of play catch up that in a lot of ways. And so if you say, hey, this is what I'm asking for, this is what I actually care about, what's the best way for me to get this, they might have useful suggestions for you. But also knowing that you're being willing to kind of meet them halfway is a lot of times going to make them more creative in terms of how they work with you. And that includes being willing to modify your request, right? So I think a lot of times government records are paper, they're physical records still, even at sort of big federal agencies. And so saying, okay, these are the records I care about. If you can get me the digital versions of these records or the digital documents that are responsive, maybe I don't need the printed records. But also be willing to push back on bad policy. So down there, I've got a couple of bit.ly links that we've worked with the Reporters Committee for the Freedom of the Press to generate data on sort of different states' policies when it comes to COVID and how responsive they're going to be. The top link is sort of local policies, so each state's policies and how they're modifying public records. And then at the second link, there also has federal policies, so how federal agencies are changing in their response to the coronavirus. And so go in, look at those policies. One thing we saw early on was a lot of local agencies saying we're going to suspend all public records access, but then most state governments were pretty quick to swat that down. But we also saw some state agencies sort of say we're going to stop responding to public records requests as well. So make sure you're pushing back on bad policy and focusing on records that are more likely to be digitally accessible or located together, right? So I think as things are constrained, figuring out what we can do to kind of make things easier for agencies to follow the law and be understanding of the situation that they're in. Now I want to start talking through some actual strategies that might be useful for trying to dig into COVID-19 data, right? So I think one thing to do is just start thinking about what new data is being generated after everything's changed with coronavirus. So one of the things is that agencies, as they're rushing to change their policies and put new programs into place, a lot of times agencies have kind of been cautious about sort of what they put in writing and sort of how they protect and guard that data. And a lot of legacy systems are really hard to export data out of. And so agencies use that as an excuse to get out of responding to public records requests. But as things move digitally, agencies have had to try to find new vendors to kind of run their programs, that means that there's all these new data opportunities, all this new data that's being generated for requesters to kind of dig into. So I thought this was a really interesting story that the Boston Globe ran a few weeks ago, where they looked at sort of what students' participation rates in e-learning. And so you can file a request for all these statistics, right? Every e-learning platform keeps statistics about how often are these classes being entered, what is the participation rate. And so, that data was available. You could see truancy rates within schools and sort of attendance rates within schools. But now for the first time, we have sort of real-time data that's being generated by these companies that you can go in and request, right? So all these sort of analytics in terms of what is the actual participation rate and how bad, all these schools have kind of reinvented their curriculum midway through the semester. And a lot of times they put out sort of, hey, things are going better than we thought or not as good as we thought. But there's actual data to go in and double check what they're actually stating. Ways to find that new data that public officials are putting out. Pay attention when the public officials talk about trends and changes. there's usually a database underlying that. So if somebody says, hey, we're seeing fewer and fewer cases coming in here, or our schools are doing a great job of this transition, they love being able to tout numbers. And so when they say, oh, we're seeing a 30% adoption of this, or we're seeing unprecedented signups for this new program we just launched, to be able to make those claims, they have to have data. And so you can ask for the underlying database about that. Sometimes that means being flexible when you request those databases and sort of saying, hey, you can redact or withhold any identifiable information. What you care about is the aggregate data, and be flexible there. But just trying to pay attention to sort of when public officials are talking about these programs, what you can do to kind of better understand them. As agencies quickly shift processes, so in the last slide, we talked about schools moving to these e-learning curriculums, but this is true throughout government right now. Check in and see what those vendors offer, right? A lot of times, a school or whatever that public entity is doing, they rely on software vendors to kind of work with them and help guide these new tools. And so going to that vendor's website and seeing what are the capabilities for exporting data that they advertise. A lot of times we've been able to go and see, oh, this school or this agency is using this service provider for their parking ticket tools or whatever else, and go to that vendor's website, and they'll be like, oh, we have these nice dashboards where you can see up to the minute analytics on whatever. And so being able to do a little background work, go to the school, figure out what they're using, go to that agency and see what they're using to track data, and then going back to their vendor and seeing what the capabilities of that vendor are. What is that vendor advertising? Sometimes this means filing a public records request for a copy of the contract or the manual for how to use that software, and that'll give you really clear ideas for what data is exportable. One thing agencies love doing is saying, oh, that data is not releasable, or we can't figure out how to get that data out. And so before you get to that kind of argument, going into the agency, doing your homework and sort of figuring out, oh, actually, here's what we can request because this vendor that they're using specifically says this can be exported, will give you a big leg up. And then paying attention when public officials talk about positive numbers, when they sort of tout successes of programs, making a little note to yourself to follow up in 3 or 4 weeks with a public records request and double check and see if those numbers have changed, right? I think one of the things we've seen over the last few months is public officials are very quick to call victory. They're very quick to sort of tout things when things are good, and I think that's a very natural impulse. But I think being willing to kind of go in and be patient and say, hey, the mayor was able to release this kind of data 3 or 4 weeks ago. I want a copy of the latest numbers of that same data set where this was pulled from, will help you kind of follow up on these stories and dig a little bit more deeply into them. Another good public record strategy is to pay attention to sort of how is the world changing. I think one of the things that's really interesting is sort of looking at how older laws are being reused in different ways or simply ignored during the pandemic. And so one of our partners, the Virginia Center for Investigative Journalism, had a really fascinating story where they looked at all the privacy laws that Virginia's school system had and how that was changing during the coronavirus. So in Virginia, there was certain limitations around how schools could sort of disclose data. And what this investigation found was that schools were just kind of ignoring these requirements, or they were making families sort of wave away their rights when it came to privacy, how their data was being protected, et cetera. And so looking at sort of how agencies are reconfiguring themselves along a whole variety of axes is going to be really, really important. And sometimes that comes down to sort of also looking at sort of budgeting, right? I think one thing that local government is going to get hit really, really hard on in the coming months is sort of all these different revenue sources are taking a big hit, whether that's licensing fees or parking tickets, all sorts of different ways that things are being rewritten. And so I think taking a look and sort of taking a step back and looking not just at sort of the immediate health crisis, but also looking at sort of what are all the sort of second order and third order impacts from that, and how can public records help tell that story. Just to give you an example, here was a copy of that request. So this is looking at sort of how these policies changed during the pandemic. But you know, these requests were actually filed before the pandemic started, and then became very suddenly relevant as things moved more digital. And so you can see that even though this is a story about the shifts during the coronavirus, it doesn't directly have anything to do with the coronavirus. Another strategy is to take a look at sort of public policy and then use public records to kind of dig into sort of how public policy is or is not being executed, right? So I think you can ask for, I want a copy of any COVID-19 related memorandums around staff treatment, and then file records requests for emails and disciplinary measures, et cetera, to see how is that actually being carried out on the ground, right? So I think one of the things we've seen is sort of agencies will sort of say one thing, they'll put in a policy up top that is designed to sort of protect safety or to continue on with their mission, but then sort of the expectations for what the agency is delivering don't change. And so people cut corners, right? So here we have a memorandum sent out around the coronavirus in California. But then you see agencies, when you go in and you sort of look at emails, people aren't following those. People aren't being responsive to concerns or best practices. And so I think being able to both request, hey, I want a copy of the policy that's being sent around, and seeing how that internal agency policy measures up to state guidance and CDC guidance, but then taking that a step downward and sort of looking at, okay, is this actually being followed through? Are the sort of disciplinary measures, you know, on the day-to-day, on the very ground level, what does the communication look like and requesting there? Just want to take a look at any questions. So did anybody have any records requests that they're kind of workshopping, or areas that they would like, and they have open questions about? We'd be happy to field some questions. Somebody asked about the link for upcoming trainings. I just want to drop that in there. Somebody has a hand raised. Great. So somebody asked, how do we know when to escalate a rejection and pursue legal resources? So that's a really good question in terms of sort of when do you stop working with an agency and when do you start trying to use more force with that agency? And so I think that's oftentimes a really tough judgment call. I think during the pandemic, I've tried to be more flexible with our requesting, but one thing I'd ask early up front is for an estimated completion date. And so can they give you an estimated completion date that seems reasonable? And if they can't, then, you know, that's a good sign that maybe this isn't actually moving forward, right? So I think going back and forth and seeing if there's good faith, is there regular communication? And do you feel like things are actually, can they show you progress? That's a sign that you might want to keep working with them. If it feels like things are stalled out and they can't really give you a good answer about why, that's usually an indication that there's something else kind of weird going on with the agency. A lot of times I'll have a request that's kind of stalled, and it turns out that that public records officer just can't hear back from internally in the agency. People aren't returning their emails. But at that point, there's nothing they can do. And so at that point, the best thing you can do is sort of file an appeal and escalate that issue, because that person isn't even empowered within their own organization to solve your question. So if they can give you an estimated completion date, if they're communicating with you in a way that you feel like progress is being made, that's great. If not, um, the next step is an administrative appeal, is usually where we recommend going next. Most states do have an administrative appeal process, so you don't need a lawyer at that stage. For states that don't have an administrative appeal, there's a number of nonprofit groups that do work pro bono with journalistic requesters as well as other requesters. And so I recommend the National Free Information Coalition. They have state organizations around the country that can sort of, sometimes just having somebody from a third party come into that agency and start, asking questions is enough to kind of unstick requests. There's also the Media Free Expression Law Network, which is a group of legal clinics around the country that are interested in First Amendment and free expression issues. And then there's Gumshoe Group, which is a really great organization that works with freelance reporters that can help provide sort of pro bono resources. And usually that starts with sort of not necessarily threat of lawsuit, but just kind of bringing in a third party to kind of start poking at that agency. How do you deal with agencies that keep using COVID as an excuse to push back your requests? That's a really great question, right? So I think at this point, it's become clear that COVID-19 is going to be with us for a long time. And so I think if agencies are saying, hey, we need extra 5 days, I think that's reasonable. If agencies are saying, if you have a fairly narrowly scoped request, and they're saying, hey, it's going to take us months to respond to this request, I think that's worth escalating, right? So I think it's sort of proportional. It depends on sort of, is this a broad request? If this is a broad request, then months might be reasonable for a lot of requesters. If this is something that's fairly tightly scoped and the agency says, oh, we're just not going to be able to respond to this, most states have kind of said at this point that yes, agencies do get extra flexibility, but they don't, this is not a get out of FOIA free card. And so being willing to kind of escalate from there. So I would give agencies an extra week or so, depending on sort of the timeliness of the request and sort of your urgency. If somebody's saying that we're not going to be able to give any kind of response timeline, that's a big red flag. And so I think similar to the other question, can they give you an estimated completion date, and can they give you an explanation of why? And so I think for that question, how do you push back on agency using COVID as an excuse? Ask them to explain what's going on. And if it's just we're short staffed, say, hey, I'm really sorry about that. I'm happy to negotiate my request, but I do need a timely answer. And I think that's something that most agencies are responsive to, and agencies that aren't responsive to could probably use a little extra pressure on them. Great request. Is there a rule of thumb about what is a reasonable administrative fee to charge for a FOIA request? So this is going to vary state by state. Almost every state now has sort of specific guidelines, and that's usually sort of the cost of researching that request from the lowest paid employee plus the physical cost of reproducing those documents. And so what we've seen is that 97% of requests that are not commercial requests, agencies don't charge fees for. And when they do charge fees, it's usually sort of limited. So if you're asking for a few pages of documents, you should not have the agency coming back and saying that's going to be hundreds of dollars. I once spent $700 on a PowerPoint presentation, and I'm still angry about it 5 years later. So I think usually 10 cents a page is sort of roughly what agencies charge. If there's a lot of searching and that sort of thing, that can be one thing. Most agencies use fees as a chance to kind of start a negotiation for a requester. And so they should also be able to explain how they came to this cost. So much of the time when I've seen agencies kind of come up with an unreasonable cost, when the requester goes back to them and says, hey, can you give me a cost breakdown? That's when the agency says, oh, actually, we miscalculated this. So always feel free to ask for, hey, can you explain these costs for me? you know, and give me suggestions for modifying this request so I can reduce the burden on the agency, right? So I think a lot of agencies, especially federal agencies, see fees as a chance to sort of start a negotiation. Local agencies, less likely to charge fees, but they're much more arbitrary. And so they should at least give you a breakdown. And for things that are hundreds of dollars, I almost always see that breakdown shrink once you ask them to sort of start itemizing it. Can you list those orders out for us somewhere after the presentation to have as a resource? Yeah, we're gonna post this video on our website next week once we've had a chance to kind of clean it up. And so I'll make sure to include links to those organizations after that. So if you sign up for this mailing list or you know, just check out muckrock.com next week, we'll get this reposted. Thanks for that suggestion. Oh, this is a great question. So is there a good way to ask an agency that sends a rejection to change their mind because an agency in a neighboring city, same state, released the same records? I've tried this a couple times and I mostly get rejected again. I'm really surprised that that's not worked out for you because peer pressure absolutely works with agencies. I think it depends on the type of rejection and sort of their you know, the reason, like what was the reasoning, right? Was this a national security exemption? Was this hey, we're having trouble finding this information? So I would look into the sort of the reasoning behind the rejection. And at that point, I would include both peer pressure saying, hi, these 3 other agencies have released this information. If you can find a decision, a lot of state attorney generals or sort of decision-making bodies when it comes to public records post their decisions when it comes to sort of public records outcomes. So if you can find some sort of like, oh, the state's attorney general or the secretary of state or the Open Government Commission previously found that this type of information was released, here's a link where you can look at their decision. But then also that's at the point where bringing in the big guns, so to speak, can be helpful. And so if you can give them a hint that it's going to be easier for them to just comply with their request than to continue holding out, that's an area of leverage that you can always be looking at. And that might mean reaching out to your open government group. That might mean finding a lawyer who's willing to just put something on letterhead. One of the things I've found is just that legal letterhead, a lot of agencies will play all sorts of games with requesters or journalists, but as soon as they get something with a lawyer's legal letterhead on there, then they kick that up to their agency's attorney, and people usually shape up pretty quickly after that. But that's a great question. And I think using peer pressure, especially if you're doing a larger project, there have been numerous studies that have found this an effective tactic of saying these 5 other agencies have released this information, but if an agency is still rejecting it, that's where you might want to look into sort of like finding an attorney or finding an outside group that'll also go to bat for you. Thank you everybody so much. These were fantastic questions. And let me just double check the comments to make sure I didn't miss anything there. We are really excited to dig into some deep technical topics in the upcoming sessions. We're hoping to do these about every 2 weeks. And so in upcoming trainings, we'll be looking at mortality data in different states. We'll also be looking at sort of the impact of machine learning and sort of automated decision making when it comes to the coronavirus response. And so we're really excited to bring in some external experts for those discussions and continue the conversation. If you have topics that you'd like to see us cover in a future training, please feel free to reach out to us. I'm Michael at muckrock.com or info@muckrock.com. We also have a free FOIA Slack where people come in and ask and answer questions. You can sign up at muckrock.com/Slack. Just scroll down and put in your information. We'll get you added. So thank you all for joining us on this Friday afternoon. I really do appreciate all the great reporting work that's out there, and we hope this has been helpful.